for anyone who doesn't know me. Thank you, Zoom. And I'll be presenting with Josh Fiala on some research that we've done related to form-based code. This is a subject that has been interesting to me. And what we want to do is kind of understand really first what is form-based code, what are some of the pros and cons, what are areas of or keys to success as well as pitfalls, and ultimately where MAPC sort of belongs within this space. We have way more content in this presentation than we could actually get through today, so we're going to fly through a lot of it, but this will be made available for people who do want to kind of engage with it in a deeper fashion. Also on that note, the way that I set this up, there's kind of traditional presentation slides, and then there are slides with full text that, again, people can sort of read at their leisure. The process that Josh and I went through for this over the past year, this was funded by the Executive Director Fund. This work was, we did a number of interviews with municipal folks, with practitioners, both local and national, attended conferences and specific sessions within conferences related to form-based code, as well as the traditional internet research. So with that, I'm going to start by giving an overview of what form-based code is and some of our thoughts on it. I'll hand it over to Josh to talk a little bit more about the nitty-gritty details and briefly highlight some of our own work that we've done in this space, and then I'll wrap things up. And I would say if people have questions and comments as we go through, feel free to just shout them out. So what is form-based code? This actually was not as simple of a question to answer as I think I maybe originally thought. It's kind of one of those things where we sort of know it when we see it. Form-Based Code Institute, which is part of Smart Growth America, has a sort of clunky definition, I would say, but the first sentence, I think, gives, I think, some of the key aspects that they seek to foster predictable results, that there's a focus on the public realm, and that it uses the physical form rather than a focus on uses as the primary basis for the code itself. One of the people that we interviewed, who is not related to Mark, said that had a much simpler definition: any code that seeks to achieve a deliberate physical outcome. I think that still isn't enough for us to understand what is a form-based code, and so I'm going to go a little bit deeper in terms of what we see. First, one of the questions that we always get, and that I was wondering, is it a form-based code if it contains uses, or is that a separate thing? If they do contain uses, do we call that a hybrid code? What I have there, this image, is something that maybe some of you recall from planning school. This is the original code for one of the original form-based codes from the town of Seaside in Florida, and it was literally a one-page long document. But in reality, all form-based codes that we have, they do contain use provisions. So it's not an either or. But really, the main difference is that form-based codes put the primacy on the form, whereas traditional zoning obviously puts the primacy on the use, and form is done in a much sort of, let's say, blunt manner. A few other aspects I think help understand what is a form-based code. One is the use of diagrams and visuals. I think that is one of the key characteristics that form-based codes have. Ideally, they're done in a way that is simpler to understand than our traditional zoning, so they're not necessarily written for only lawyers, but developers, lay people can understand it, and they're set up in a more clear manner. Often what we have is that a quote-unquote hybrid code is one which includes part of the community has traditional zoning that applies to it, and part of it has, often in a mixed-use neighborhood, would be a form-based code approach. They can be highly prescriptive, but they can also just be more of a set of what I would call principles to help establish what the general form would look like. There's a number of different ways to organize the code. I'll touch on those in a couple of minutes. And then I think just the other point I would make here is, again, there's a lot more attention to what goes on in the sort of the intersection between the private and the public realm. One of the big, I think, takeaways that Josh and I came away with was that there isn't this clear distinction between traditional zoning and full form-based code. And so we thought it's more appropriate to think of this as a spectrum, where you do have the Euclidean zoning on the one end of the spectrum, and then you might have a full code transition on the others, but there's a lot in between it that can be considered either form-based code or at least including elements of form-based code. And so that's this, I'm going to go through this now. Even here, this kind of setup that I created, I think it still isn't perfectly clean. There's a lot of overlap in a lot of areas. There's also this issue of what about design guidelines, and I'll talk about this a little bit, but this is something that MAPC has done traditionally as part of our zoning, and that's sort of a separate kind of bucket in and of itself. There is an area where there are some basic design requirements, and we think that in most cases MAPC should at least be working in that bucket for most of our place-based zoning. And then as you go further along the spectrum, that's where things become more advanced and require some, I think, advanced, not just skills, but urban design sort of knowledge and thinking. So starting on the traditional end of the spectrum, Euclidean zoning, of course, focuses on a strict separation of uses. I think most of our communities these days do have at least one area that they're at least considering for a mix of uses, but what we often see is that the tools that we have employed to shape what the resulting development would be really don't lead to good outcomes in a lot of ways. So one example is we often use or have used as planners floor area ratio as one of the measures, FAR, which is an indication of density, but not at all an indication of the character of the resulting development. So the diagram that I put there, both of those are an FAR of 1. It could be a single-story building that covers a whole lot. It could be a 4-story building that covers a quarter of the lot. So in my work, I always try to avoid using FAR where possible. For this reason, we have much better ways to kind of shape the built form, so I find it unnecessary. Another measure of density we often use is units per acre. I know this isn't going anywhere. It's written into the guidance for the Section 3A requirements. I think there is a little bit more of a performance that's built into indicator that's built into this measure. But again, it really does not show what the resulting future development could look like. The image on the left is from Salem, and I think it's sort of universally loved in the neighborhood. That's actually a 25 unit per acre building. It's quite small, but it's on a very small lot. Totally different from the image on the right, which is from the Woburn 40R that we worked on. That's a huge building, and that's only 15 units per acre because it's on a huge lot with lots of retail. So extremely different character, even though the one on the left is quite a bit denser. Another issue with focusing on use, here we have two examples of row houses or townhomes. Again, the one on the left, if you're only focused on use, you can have very different results. The one on the right is clearly more autocentric and frankly ugly, I think, to most of us. Similarly on, here's an example of multifamily buildings. I know the one on the left is a little unfair because I used a Google street shot when there was some construction going on. That's at Dedham Corporate Center, right across from their commuter rail station. If anything, it's worse in person, I would say. It's kind of this huge building out of context, surrounded by a sea of parking, separated by a metal fence, further separated from the sidewalk by some kind of useless strip of grass. It does not integrate at all with the built form, as opposed to the example on the right, which is a similar scale building, but really knits into the fabric of the community. One of the questions that we had grappled with was, well, is it because we have applied traditional zoning incorrectly, or are there actual issues that are inherently wrong with traditional zoning? And I think it's a little bit of both. The focus on separation of uses is something that can be changed, and we have seen it change, that you can integrate that into traditional types of zoning. But that being said, as I think I keep sort of alluding to, the tools to actually shape the built environment are, I think, inherently not present in traditional zoning. I think that's why we do need at least some elements of what I would consider form-based code within our future zoning work for these types of areas. So I mentioned design guidelines. So these are an advisory separate document that supplements the zoning bylaws. Josh and I know each of us have worked on a number of these. There are advantages to working on design guidelines, so I'm not suggesting that they should go away, but there are also some clear cons associated with them. And here I've sort of summarized that. One of the biggest pros is that they don't have to go to town meeting because it's not a bylaw, so the planning board can adopt it. That makes it easier to adopt. It also makes it easier to update along the way if you find something's not working. So that's a clear advantage. There is greater flexibility in terms of the content, but that also can lead to issues though. So often these are associated with a special permit process. So I think a best practice is we should try to have as much as possible be by right. They can lead to some arbitrary or unclear decision-making processes, and that adds cost to the landowners. It creates uncertainty, whereas whether it's design standards, which are obligatory, they should be clear, and it should be understood whether you are meeting these requirements or not. I'm going to pause one second. I see a couple of chats coming up, so I just want to look at those. Okay.
So, Chris, the one thing I would say is there are occasionally design guidelines that are part of site plan review that are just by right.
Yep, that's true. And they can be, but they still tend to be advisory. So that's still, that is one of the issues. So here now we're getting closer into where we're including, again, what I mentioned is, I think, some minimum requirements that generally we should be at least considering. And this can be done simply through text, although including diagrams would be ideal. These are things like, where's the location of the parking? Is it right in front of the building, or are you requiring it to the side or to the rear of the building? That makes a huge difference in terms of the feel for a pedestrian. Some basic standards as it relates to articulating the buildings to avoid blank walls and monotony. What occurs within the front yard? So is there cafe seating, for example? These are fairly basic. I would still say that the context still matters. So it's not simply a matter of copy and paste from one bylaw to another, because if, for example, you're along Route 1 in Saugus, that's never going to be a little sort of strolling Main Street. So you can't have the same exact solution as we could in downtown Dedham, for example. I wanted to draw your attention to this tool, and I have this in the resources. This is something that I'm including. I think it sort of falls within this area of these basic design requirements, and it's this concept called lean urbanism. And so the idea is that as opposed to doing a full, complete form-based code, this focuses on the lower cost, sort of quicker hits that can make a big difference. So sort of high value, I would call them. And so this is something to consider, especially for smaller budget projects where we just want to make it better than what's been done in the past, even if it's perhaps not perfect. Now as we get into the advanced design requirements, this is at the point of the spectrum that I think is more associated with form-based code, especially when they do include the diagrams. The elements start to build off of the basic design requirements from the previous part on the spectrum, and we're putting a lot more attention into the built form in general, but especially what happens along the frontage in particular. So you might include things here like, what is the maximum width of a building, which can be controversial for some architects or some developers. We might include things like what types of buildings are allowed, and then there could be other aspects that are again, more, I think, closely associated with a form-based code. There's something called a regulating plan, which is either an alternative or a supplement to the zoning map. These kind of thumbnail images that I include there just sort of show that when you kind of include it in this format with the images and with kind of clear tables, that is where, again, even if the content might be a little bit different from text, I think we could very clearly call this a form-based code approach in those situations. The final one is the full code transition. This is could be done at a municipal level. Somerville has, I think, probably the only example that's adopted in our region. Newton's been working on it, but it hasn't been fully adopted. This could also be for large portions of a community. So I might put Situate in this bucket here, where they have a full code for all of their, or some of their village centers. This area, when you're in this part of the spectrum, they might use different types of organizing principles that are not our use-based zones, and I'll talk quickly about what some of those might be. To do this does require probably the most amount of investment in time. I think depending on the scale of it at MAPC, we would probably be well served to partner in some cases with other private developers, private firms on this type of work. This example here, this is probably the most famous form-based code template. This is the SMART code, which some of you may have heard of, and instead of using use-based zones, it uses zones based upon intensity, from the rural to urban transect. They are, form-based code practitioners love to use the term calibrate, so these are calibrated to the specific community, so what the actual requirements of a T4 in one of our communities that's very suburban might be different from something very urban. So I haven't seen this actually employed here in our region, but it is kind of very well known. And this shows that an example of how this map would work, and I've included this one in particular because you can still create overlay districts the way that we might often have. And within land use, I know some of us have done work related to transfer of development rights projects in TDR, and this shows an example where a TDR was included as part of this form-based code. Building type is another common organization. The screenshot on the bottom there, that's directly from Somerville's code, and so every area has different allowable building types, and then there are different lot, building, and other types of requirements for every type of building. This, I think, is a good way to organize things, and I think we can do this type of work. Even here, though, there is some extra complexity because if you, for example, allow a multifamily building and you have certain requirements for it, you have to think through, will those requirements differ if it's in different parts of the town? And that's where I have seen communities get into some trouble. The final one, which I just note, is this concept of organizing what it can be built based upon the street frontage. This is something I think is a very interesting way to approach it, as we often have sort of a commercial or arterial run through a neighborhood, and then right maybe one parcel deep, you're into lower density residential. So I think this could be a good solution, but I haven't actually seen it done very commonly. So with that, I will hand it over to Josh.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
So we have a few, I want to talk through kind of practical ways that this work, research can be integrated into our work. And not so much to say, here's all the frontage types and all the building types that you should use, but I think generalizing this work, because one of the things we've learned is that the form-based practitioners, the national experts, are getting together at conferences, debating how many frontage types and how many building types, or maybe building types are better than frontage types and all this. So I think there's, what we learned is that the realm of form-based codes and how to put them together and to compose this is not settled. There's no one model to do it. So these are some take-home messages that we have to share. The first is to really define the purpose. Everyone we interviewed and spoke to told us the importance of having a vision before you do any zoning of any kind, to make sure that there's a vision that you're making the zoning, crafting it for. And so that's no different for form-based zones and form-based codes, or introducing form-based elements into the zoning. So whether the vision is already developed through a planning process, a master plan, a district planning process that's occurred before you, and you're implementing that with the zoning, it's important to make sure that you're tying the vision in critical ways back to the language or the diagrams that you're putting together for the zone. Or if we're entering the zoning process without a vision already established, it's important for us to scope that work in such a way that we do visioning as a part of a first step in that zoning process, so that we're working towards something that is agreed to with the community. And we really need to get as specific as possible with that vision, that so just saying mixed use is not adequate. That's not a good enough vision. We need to define with the community what they want the place to look like. So the diagram on the screen is a great example of, you can imagine either through words or maybe working in a charrette style with visual images or visual preference surveys, which we do, ways that the community could describe what their vision is in a very concrete way, and it might reflect in the image. But if you don't get that reflected into the zoning, this might be what you end up with from that vision. So I think what we're learning through this research is it's very important to think about, I'll just go back to this other diagram, to think about all the pieces in this visual, the relationship of the building to the street, what's happening between the building and the street, the articulation of the building in terms of its windows, its facade design, all these things, every single thing that you see in this visual image which makes it attractive, we need to think about a way to extract that into words or a diagram and get it into the zoning bylaw. I think that's the critical lesson that we're learning. Otherwise, the things that you don't define will either get lost, or the development team will make the decision for you if it's not defined. So that's what you see here. There's a completely different relationship of the building to the street, of how the landscapes work, and if the sidewalks are working. You don't have that street life and activation that looks like a much more auto-oriented place. So that's really, I think, the take-home message for much of what we heard is really defining the vision first and making sure that we move that vision to specific requirements into the zoning. So there are a few other typical elements of form-based codes that we can talk through a little bit. So Chris touched on some of these. There are basically typologies that are put together for different types of lots, buildings, building types, or frontage types, and open space. And those typologies are really trying to be composed to define the options that a development team might have available. So making sure that they have good options that they can work within, and that those options are thought about in advance so that they, however they're composed together, are creating the place that you desire. So form-based can also include more detailed elements and the traditional elements of zoning which we want to see in our work. So affordable housing requirements, parking requirements, architectural or landscape standards, stormwater management. So any of these elements which we want to get into our code, a more equitable focus on ground floor uses, all of that can be integrated. So it's not a one, choose one route or the other. Anything we want to do is available. And on the screen is an example of architectural standards. We're not saying that those are necessary in every case, but there might be some circumstances where the look and feel of the buildings themselves is critically important to tie it into the surrounding context or neighborhood, particularly if it's a more historic district or has many historic assets. One of the most important ways to do that, and I think this is key, is to look at every place we work has a great example of a good building or a good site relationship in that context. And I think that's one of the things, working with communities that you can help them to identify and tell to you is what's working really well in the area that they are, and give you some concrete examples of this, this building down on Elm Street or this place here, those are really beautiful places. And then to go to those places either virtually or in reality and think about what are the pieces of that place that make it special or unique. And then how can you extract those pieces into the code itself? So in this case, is it the front porch, or the way that the front facade is divided into bays, or the dormer at the top level? the pitched roof, the front yard, with the landscape, the relationship to the sidewalk, how it's oriented to the sidewalk and has, longer depth of the building with parking that's in more of an alley or driveway setup adjacent to the side. So those are all things which can be thought through with that example and then spelled out in great detail. Just a very specific side note, one of the things we heard over and over, and that we've run into in our zoning work too, is in terms of building height, to start getting away from, if you see it happening, defining building height as a measure of feet. That's created problems. It's created problems in places I've worked in, Dedham and Norfolk and Winchester, and instead defining building height as a number of stories. That gives flexibility. We don't know exactly sort of how building types are trending or will be trending. It's particularly difficult in mixed-use areas where the building height is, if it's defined in feet, is typically too small, too short. And then you have buildings which are trying to squish into that smaller building height, and it just creates all sorts of visual and design problems. So it's better to identify that intent through stories. So is it 3 stories, 3.5 stories, where you might have a pitched roof with an occupiable space in the half story above the third. But that gives the development team the flexibility to define the heights that they want to do and make a building which is visually appealing and proportional. So it's all about really defining, as you can hear, not saying, like, here's the form-based menu and taking all the pieces that you want, but defining what's interesting and important in the context that you're working in, and then figuring out the best way to either visualize or describe that through sections in your zoning bylaw. So it might be the height, it might be the building footprint and the relationship, it might be that front setback area, or it might be architectural elements. But it doesn't really matter what those pieces are. You don't need to be comprehensive with all of them either. You can find the ones that are the most critical and important to identify and specify, and then work with that. One very interesting example we came across was in the town of Littleton. So they have a recently adopted form-based code in the Littleton Town Common area. And this is, I think it's an interesting model because they focused on sort of I call it like a connected farmhouse village building typology. So you can see what sort of prompted this effort is the diagram on the left was a diagram of what their zoning, as it previously existed, could have resulted in. And so they weren't happy thinking about this diagram in the types of development which could occur. And they wanted their town center, their town common, to evolve in a way that was, more productive and stronger with each of those investments. Because that's the other thing that's critically important about all this is you don't get too many chances for redevelopment or for the investment in some of these properties. So you want to make sure that those investments are as productive as possible. The diagram on the right is where their form-based code is headed, which is more of a building oriented to the sidewalk, the parking slid completely to the rear, and the breaking down, bulking up and breaking down of the building massing to create more of a there in the village common. So the form-based code which they came up with doesn't look totally foreign, so it has language with intent and purpose of the district. It goes on with some applicability and definitions. Just a general note that we tend to like to put definitions into their own section in the zoning bylaw or add definitions to that section. Putting section definitions in, they tend to get lost or easy to have conflicts in that way. But then they do have, in addition to the more traditional text portions of that bylaw, some diagrams and some more definition in terms of how the building sits on the lot. So for example, a very simple way to do that is to have a setback maximum in addition to a setback minimum, so that you're actually placing the building within a certain range from the lot line, rather than saying, I see your 5-foot minimum and I'm going to put my building 50 feet back and then do something that is undesirable in the front of the building. So it's good to set a maximum as well if you really do want that more urban village environment. And then they worked a lot in terms of diagrams and language about the massing of the buildings and having a series of more modestly scaled gabled shapes which could connect and expand with the addition of more gabled shapes. To really keep the look and feel of the more modest village common that they were after. And there's additional standards about height and building separation, and some additional diagrams about how additions or frontages would occur, and defining the scale and projection and how those pieces all fit together. Yeah.
Who did this for them?
This was a form-based code by UTO. It's an architectural design consultant in Boston. Yeah. And then they had diagrams about how to sort of compose all these massing through building assembly. So it's a really, I think, interesting and compelling case, not necessarily because of the way that they put the form-based code together, but because of the way that it responds to the vision Littleton has for their common. And thinking about that prototype of a connected farmhouse with gabled roofs and the smaller massing.
What's a Texas donut?
It's that style of building. That's a footprint of those huge buildings.
Yeah, the example on the bottom is more of what I think you might, not necessarily in some of our town centers, but what you might tend to see the scale of development occurring. You're really getting huge buildings that are lining a parking garage. We don't see those so much in our more urban communities, but more in the inner core. But that's the scale, for example, that they're trying to avoid through this form-based effort. The other thing about Littleton that's interesting is that in talking to their town planner, Maren Tuhill, they have a few projects which she thinks are going to be coming forward for approval soon through this form-based code. So this is an interesting place to watch to see how the developers and owners of those projects respond to the form-based code and how effective it is in guiding the resulting development outcomes. They do have some design guidelines that get into more details of it there. So that's a good example.
Josh, what was the timing between when it was passed and when it took effect?
I think from the town meeting approval?
Yeah.
I don't think that time period was that long,
Okay.
a few months. I don't think she said it was fine in terms of the Attorney General's office, and there was no complaints from that review in terms of its setup. I think from the longer time period was from like the vision for their town common to establishing the actual form-based code, and she said that required, I think it was a multi-year planning effort to develop the form-based code, and it required a fair amount of local education and hand-holding with the boards and committees to help them. I think they were supportive of it along the way, but it was a little bit of a mindset shift to move into the more prescriptive approach to how they wanted the form to evolve. There are some other examples beyond Littleton, so we just wanted to highlight these for you all. A lot of them we've been involved in, Chris specifically. So Situate Village Centers and Neighborhoods, the Salem Bridge Street Neck, Rockport Transit Overlay Village, and Ashland Downtown. So these are all examples. We have some more details here. I don't need to go through these in too much detail, but I'll just flip through to show you some examples of what's involved in these. So for example, in the Situate centers, there are building types, which Chris did some work to actually make sure that they're coordinated and not causing conflicts. It was put together, the template for these was put together by a previous consultant working with the town, and then we did some work following up on that. One thing I wanted to say about the Village Centers is also similarly an interesting place because they have some real projects which are developing from the form-based code efforts. I would point to the example which is on the upper left here, I guess in the bottom left, which is a gas station, which is, and people call these gas backwards gas stations. But this is an outcome which would not happen if it were not for the form-based code approach, being very specific about how you would want this type of project And as you can imagine, we've all seen gas stations along a main street or town center, which are pretty destructive in terms of the walkability and urbanism of that environment. And this is much better to put the convenience store and gas station store portion of it back towards the street frontage and define that frontage nicely, and then have the gas in the back, which is equally as accessible by vehicles and convenient, so it's fine. But it's a huge difference, and you wouldn't get that result without being specific about it. It's going to just show up to town and build it this way. So I'll just flip through the others. So Salem Bridge Street Neck overlay, built upon a vision that Chris developed, and then has some specifics about how the buildings are arranged on the lots, some features and diagrams in terms of the appendages and accessories to those buildings. And similarly, in the Rockport Transit-Oriented Village Overlay District, there was a visioning process that preceded it, and then some lot and building types that help to translate that vision into the zoning code with some additional guidance in terms of the design. And for the Ashland Downtown District, that was not composed by us, but then we've done some help with it as well. So this is taking a look at the building types that they had proposed. In this case, they'd used building types more as examples, which I think is maybe a little less successful, because you really want to think through the requirements and use the building types in a way that's more about defining what the options are. You don't want to say like, well, here's some nice examples, because I don't think it will translate to the built outcomes that you want to see in real life on those properties. So it's really about getting, these processes are about getting the requirements specifically into the bylaws, so that the built outcomes are as close to that vision as possible. And then they do have some additional details about what roof styles are appropriate, things that the building window placement, and stuff like that. So there's, as Chris mentioned, there's a lot more detail in this presentation, which we'll share and make available if you want to take your time and read through all these things.
All right, so I will conclude just with a couple things. So I think one just takeaway from the examples that Josh was just showing, we have been doing form-based code within this agency, we just maybe haven't been calling it that. So I think that's one thing for us to keep in mind. In some ways, it's sort of how we position things. The other kind of big takeaway is we're focused a lot on sort of what the buildings look like and et cetera, and how they come together, but ultimately, I think this is really about creating better neighborhoods and more distinct places that people want to live and be and help sort of thrive in. So I think that's, it's not just about the buildings themselves. We look into a number of issues. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them here. One is a lot of form-based codes, they have a lot of sort of roadway standards, and it's frankly unclear how they can actually be required and implemented. So this is one thing, if anybody is sort of taking this on, that I think takes a lot of thought. We know how to do this, for example, widening the sidewalk, we can require that, but we can't really require a developer to put a bike lane in front of his 40 feet of frontage. That wouldn't make sense. So that's one of the challenges that, at least in Massachusetts, we have. I don't really understand how it's been implemented in other places. Another question is, as it relates to larger developers, one of the things, just examples, it's clear that developers are coming in with plans to develop under the form-based code, which is great. Larger places like in Avalon, they sort of have their kind of kits of how they do things. It's not clear, I think, as of yet, whether they will actually change their processes to do this. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, but I think it is just something to consider the implications for. We talked a lot about uses. Again, they of course will have uses, but we should try to keep them as simple as possible, and to the extent possible, we should try and have things by right, because we have so much extra detail in terms of what the expectations and requirements are that should allow for by right development. A number of staff were asking about what are the legal issues, and we talked to all of the municipalities that we interviewed this, or we asked this specific question, It doesn't seem like there have been legal issues to date that have come up as it relates to the form-based code. So as of now, it seems like there's no major concerns in terms of implementing this. There are certain things we know we can't do regardless of whether it's form-based code versus traditional zoning, like we can't dictate the types of materials that are used, for example, but that's nothing new. Josh, I think I had already mentioned this, but again, of course, MAPC staff are interested in how do we incorporate equity and can we, and really the short answer is there's no fundamental difference in terms of how we incorporate all of the various equity measures that we care about into the code. So I think I would just say kind of in terms of where we're at for next steps, I think it would be useful to start developing a number of diagrams that we can use and kind of pick and choose from so that we're not starting from scratch every time. I think more thought has to be given to whether we want to have a certain sort of method and sort of standardization. Are we using building types, for example, versus not? Or do we take it on a case-by-case basis? I think those are some of the issues that I think we still need to grapple with. But with that, this document, which we'll send around, I've included some resources that might be helpful. I started putting together some glossaries of some of the terms that I keep hearing, like calibrating, which we don't normally use, I think, as in traditional zoning. That's about it. I think we'll stop there for some questions and comments. Eric.
In the example that Josh showed on the mixed use, like you had this beautiful vision and then you had this reality. It seemed like the biggest difference between those two was the roadway. I mean, the roadway in the real life example was like just a sea of pavement. And to Chris's point about there's questions about how much you can regulate like the roadway width and standards and design elements. I'm just curious about that because that seemed like by far the biggest difference between those two images.
Yeah, I think, in my opinion, it's not, in our context, the most productive approach to do like street types. I think there are other processes to make the roadways match that vision. I think complete streets processes in our cities and towns are probably the more sort of effective approach to do that, both in terms of design and dollars. I think there's extra complications because most of, not all of, but many of the main streets that we're talking about in these village center type environments that would be most form-based code are state routes. So you're having to deal with MassDOT and their design standards as well. So it's not, I don't think it's, I mean, maybe if you wanted to show an example of the ideal vision for the street design from your, the vision of the community and what you're headed toward, that might be a worthwhile diagram to make and just kind of show to have that out there. But I think that it's not necessarily then going to get implemented through the zoning bylaw. It's going to get implemented through those other.
One of the interviewees really sort of cautioned against thinking that form-based code is going to solve all the problems, and I think that was an example of a type of roadway. There's other aspects that need.
I would add to that, though, Eric, the thing that popped out most to me was the space between the street and the building as one of the main differences in those diagrams. And I think that is fully within the control of what we can require in zoning to how that frontage works and what the character of that frontage is, how the building is interacting with the street. So that's from even all the way from the curb to the building front, which would include the sidewalk area and then whatever landscape's happening. I think that is a huge difference in the two images.
Carlos first.
Sure. For some of the examples that you mentioned there was like a building type approach and then there was a street frontage approach. Have you seen or is it possible to combine those or is that not?
It could be possible, yeah. I just haven't seen the street frontage approach actually applied, but I've seen building types applied to different organizations, yeah. Catherine?
Yeah, I want to go back to Eric's question. For state roads, do towns have any control about the speed limit, or is that also done by MassDOT?
good question. I'm not 100% sure.
It's just slowing it down makes it.
No,
I
the towns don't have control.
They have to ask
They have to
permission, and they
get-
have to do studies to demonstrate
Yeah.
that the speed of the road, that is, like, it's very complicated.
And then they have to take maintenance on, right?
Yeah.
I think if they do that,
I
then
think-
you have to maintain it.
Oh, wow.
But
I
there are,
believe,
Is that right?
I believe so.
So I,
But there are
if I
ways-
may, I think there's been a change in that, that we were involved in to some extent. I'm not sure I know all the details, but it used to be that the minimum speed limit was 30, the minimum posted speed limit was 30. And then I think a statute was passed giving communities the ability to go down to 25 at their own discretion. I'm not 100% sure that's the case, but you may have seen lots of 25-mile-an-hour signs popping up, and I think that's the reason for it. We could check with Eric or with Lizzie on that, Eric B. or Lizzie.
And I was just wondering if when you said how have other states gotten around this, I wonder where like county level government is stronger and you have a lot more county roads that are kind of this in between.
Yeah, that could be.
but to follow up on this, if you look at downtown Millis, that's Route 109. 15 years ago, there were no sidewalks, no curbs. Now there's a sidewalk the entire length of Route 109 in Millis on one side, and when you get into the downtown, there's sidewalk on both sides, and there are bump outs and pedestrian crossing lights. This was all done as part of the redesign of Route 109, with the town working with the state on how they wanted to have Route 109 redesigned and rebuilt as it went through town. So it is possible to do. They've even got parallel parking on parts of the downtown portions of Route 109 as you go through the center.
Are they maintaining it now, or like how?
Sorry, what?
Do they have to maintain that segment, or?
I don't know if the state had given over management of the downtown to the town. They sometimes do that. They'll say, it's still a state road, but you guys take care of this.
Annis, and then Courtney has a question on the chat.
I was just gonna add one other context element for the road discussion, is that form-based codes nationally are typically, like, they're not the New England style approach where everything's basically developed here and we're just kind of retrofitting. In other parts of the country, form-based codes are being applied to vast areas where the new roadways are part of the design.
Right.
So the new roadways are often private ways which are fully under the control of the developer in many circumstances. In which case, road types make perfect sense because you want them to build what you want them to build. I've been involved, before MAPC as a private consultant, I was involved in a few larger scale form-based code projects like in New Hampshire, where we did define road types for that purpose because it was a large orchard that didn't have any roads in it, and the developer had full control over the acreage. So I think in those circumstances, you do want to have road types, but in our practice, in our region, it's very rare that we'll have that circumstance.
Great point.
Well, I want to say thank you, first of all, for doing all of this research and putting this together. It was very well organized and easy to understand kind of everything you did. So I really appreciate it. It's a lot of work that the rest of us don't have to do ourselves. I wanted to ask about, one thing that came up for me is this idea of, like, how do you establish what are the things that are important? And it reminds me of some of the conversations we've had around the role of historical commissions and how they understand, like, what is it that they're trying to preserve. And it seems like there might be some, like, opportunity for collaboration across those, because I know that sometimes zoning is trying to be used as a way to, like, stop all development. It's like kind of a historic preservation strategy without being called that. And then the historic commissions are kind of trying to just, like, stop everything from changing. And this seems like it could be an opportunity to, like, help them categorize or characterize what is it that they think is most important about the kind of historical character of the town that they want to see, like, continue to be part of the built environment, with the caveat that I do think there are particular equity considerations in that many times the things people say they like the best are the houses that were built for the wealthiest residents, and then that may not be the thing that is most important to preserve for the needs of the entire community, and so I do think we should have some particular lens where we're checking ourselves on those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, I think thank you, Anna. That's a really helpful and great point. So Courtney is wondering about any thoughts to the scoping and the budget and the level of detail that a form-based code would have, and the cost of teaming up with a private consultant. I think we've given this a little bit of thought. I think there is going to be a premium in terms of the cost. If we start developing a bunch of a lot of the cost, I think, comes with the diagramming. That just takes time to do. So if we start developing and establishing a kit, then that would take away a little bit of the cost. I think there's still a little bit of additional cost that would be associated, because with this type of work, when we're really focused not just on the heights or the setbacks, but a lot of these other forms, elements to the form, it just takes extra time to really understand what's important and kind of include that into the codes that we're writing. So I don't think, I mean, if I had to just come up with a number, I would say maybe 10 to 15% more than a typical project. I don't know, if Josh, that's sort of off the top of my head.
Seems like a reasonable place to start, yeah. Yeah, I think there will be a premium just because of the additional detail and sort of description and visuals that you're trying to introduce into the work. But we are, I think, in our typical practice in doing zoning, particularly in mixed use or town center contexts, we are doing a lot of this work already and integrating it with our zoning revisions. So even if those, I would say, even if the resulting bylaw isn't necessarily as form-based as some of the examples that we're showing, I think in the process to get to the language, we're using many more visuals and diagrams than perhaps we did in these eras.
I'm just curious about any of the examples you looked at, like how or to what extent did they try to integrate more like resiliency standards in terms of like tree and shading and solar orientation and that kind of stuff? Is that something that they are doing? I know it sounds like you can incorporate anything you already are doing in traditional zoning, but I'm just wondering if you've seen that.
Situate did, but they sort of took this kind of full, throw it in the kitchen sink approach where they put everything in, and I think for a developer, it's almost like a pick and choose kind of thing, because there's just so much in there, and we're dealing with smaller lots where some of the things that they sort of required are probably not even possible to be doing. But the other examples that was not part of Ashland or Salem or Rockport, really. But I think we probably should pay more attention to that.
But it would lend itself, I think the more of a form-based prescriptive approach, even with the diagrams, would lend itself well to resilience vision for a district. So if they are trying to, elevate ground floors to a certain height or something, how do you mitigate between that elevation difference? What are the solutions that you want developers to choose from? So I think that, like, actually thinking through that diagram, giving viable solutions would help to resolve a lot of issues that are going to be problems for the whole district. So that reminds me, I want to circle back a little bit to Anna's question. I see Mark has his hands up too, but Anna, your question, I think it's important that to consider sort of the models that we're emulating in the very specific design requirements, in that you don't want to come up with a vision that looks awesome, but no one's ever going to build it. So I think we have to have some sort of check, and I'm not sure exactly what that check is. It might not be the same in all circumstances, but basically, like, thinking what are the premiums that we're asking for in the requirements, either visually or in the shape of the building? How does it differ from the convention of what a developer would show up for if unfettered? And would a developer actually do the things that we're asking them to do, or are they going to come in and say, like, I have my form-based project for approval, I just need like 43 variances, and I think that we need to consider how we're shaping it. And to me, that always, it points to the importance of the sort of public-private realm interface, and maybe less importance, getting some important things on terms of the architecture of the building form, but that it's really the things that make walkability happen aren't necessarily the buildings, the urbanism, and how the building's composed on the site. And those things, I think you can do a lot in that area where you won't get as much pushback as you would if you say, we only want buildings which are 20 feet wide. Like, come give us your best 20-foot wide building. And people, developers are gonna be like, you planners are crazy. But if you say, you know, give us your best landscape 20-foot frontage, and we want all this, we want it to be filled with landscape and benches and everything else, I think they would do that, so.
So let's give Mark the last word, because we're just at 10:30, and you had your hand raised, Mark.
I did, although the primary reason I had my hand raised was to encourage more response to Annis's comment. I do think there's a lot in Annis's question and in the reply that you began to provide, Josh. One thing that I've learned from this presentation is it's not just about appearance, it is about the actual goal and objective of building. What kind of a neighborhood or a community do you want to create? We have our own perspective here at MAPC, or at least we have a variety of similar perspectives with different nuances about what that good community looks like. But those are value-laden judgments, and they are not always consistent with the perspective that we may find in the community for a variety of different reasons and in a variety of different ways. And we can't talk about it now, but I do think we have to encourage a conversation about how we deal with it and address it, and how we think about the different values that people place on the built environment, and how we can either accommodate those, or when in certain circumstances we need to try and change them. I want to just close by thanking Josh and Chris for this excellent presentation. There are some new people in the room and on the screen who haven't become familiar with the Executive Discretionary Fund yet. It is not the Executive Director's Fund. It used to be. It is now the Executive Discretionary Fund. And Eric Hove is responsible for overseeing that program, in part because it is really about developing strategic initiatives and new products for MAPC. But Catherine and Lizzie and Eric and I all jointly come together to make decisions on EDF. An RFP will be going out for this year very soon, and I encourage staff and departments to respond with the primary, it's not the only objective, but the primary objective of finding better or new ways to do our work on behalf of our members and on behalf of our own strategic goals. This is, I think, is a tremendous presentation, a tremendous project. I texted Eric in the middle of this presentation that I think it would make a great APA presentation next April, which I guess you folks should think about a little bit. And I really do want to thank you for the effort you put into it.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks everybody for attending. As follow-up, I'm very happy to speak more. I'm sure John. Thank you. All right, bye, everybody.
I learned some new terms.
Oh,